We saw the VIX surge, ended up just under 5% higher, but it stalled at the 50 period, the green line there. The blue line's the 20 period moving average. Again, we had dropped below, we had gapped lower, we dropped below the lower band, we dropped below the 200, and now we've recovered back up. We do have this gap down here. Again, personal belief that the S&P is going to rally to a new all-time high, to my target levels. We're going to see this consolidation over here that, again, ahead of the election, if the bullish divergences take us to highs on the S&P, we could see the VIX come back towards the 200 period moving average and drop back below the 50. That did happen, affecting the rally with the bullish diversions on the 60-minute chart of the S&P of the election. I was expecting this pullback because of the negative diversions. I talked about both of those. Here we are stalling right here. I think we're going to continue the rally with the S&P in all likelihood, unless we start doing technical damage in the weekly and the daily time frame and start breaking down from the rising wedge immediately. Larger one that is now formed. Momentum still bearish on intraday charts. Again, I think a larger divergence is going to develop here on the RSI intraday like it did at these other tops here, at these other peaks. These were short-term pullbacks. Got a bigger one in July. This next one that we get will probably lead to a reversal and take us to the objective target levels in the monthly and the weekly time frame. I'll be watching to see if the signals turn back to bullish here as we go back and fill the gap. I think that is likely going to be the case. It may come down and fill this gap first and then rebound, but regardless of which way it plays out, I think we're going back to fill the gap at 59.50. I think we're going to go to a new all-time high unless my signals start to play out there in the weekly time frame, start doing major damage in the daily time frame. Support the channel with the link directly below that allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you like the charts, you like the indicators, please take a moment to support the channel. If you take a moment to do that, I would really appreciate it. I don't have any sponsors, just a direct relationship with you. If you follow the link, it'll take you to a secured site. You can donate any amount you want or make it a recurring donation. If you do that, I thank you. Thank you for your consideration for that. The S&P 500, again, we've seen momentum go into the negative region. I think it could still form a divergence right here. All these short-term peaking signals, as I talked about at the time. We saw the momentum line turn bearish. We never did see the reversal of conditions with momentum, but we did get the momentum line turning bearish. And I look at those two things as far as momentum. The P's point back, but these two lines represent the trend. This is a short-term trend, and this is a short-term swing move. Both still bullish at this point. The cloud has turned to red briefly, but that could just be we're getting a short-term pullback. These other signals, we're not taking them out. We're not taking out the trend line. But we could if signals start getting a sharp sell-off with the Nvidia earnings. So far, Nvidia's down about 2% in after hours. We'll see how it closes tomorrow. But again, the 200 on the 60-minute chart hold as support. We're seeing the 20-day moving average in the daily time frame hold as support. These lines right here representing the trend, short-term trend, and I should say swing move with the other one there. Okay, we just got the Nvidia earnings just a little bit ago. Nvidia topped expectations. They doubled revenue on a strong AI demand. Revenue surged 4% on an annual basis. Beat on earnings $35 billion to $33.16. They beat on earnings 81 cents to 75 cents. And about 18 minutes here after they've reported earnings, now they're down about just over 2.5%. They were down as much as 5%, over 5% at the lows, down about $7. Right now they're down about 3.82 here, just over 0.5% at just under 142 here. Watching to see how Nvidia does. The NASDAQ was down as much as 0.75% on this. The S&P was down 0.5%, and then they're rebounding back up off of those lows with the futures and after hours, referring to the NASDAQ in after hours, the NASDAQ future contracts. We'll be watching Nvidia, and again, at just under 142. Let's take a look at the chart. Here's a 5-minute chart, and you can see it. Here's the earnings being reported. It dropped, again, over 5% right there, and then recovered back up. And then sold off some more, and then now attempting to recover back up. And again, we'll be watching. We at the moment down about 2.5%. We'll be watching how it closes out tomorrow, and how does that impact the NASDAQ and the S&P 500, as well as the semiconductors. Now, Nvidia weekly chart is getting that 9 count in the weekly time frame. We started the week off on Monday turning down on Nvidia, and we've since then rebounded, but we had canceled out the count earlier in the week. Right now we have it, but it's not perfected. 7 bar is the high of the count for the week so far. I'll be watching to see if we rally up and get a perfected sell signal before the week ends. Bitcoin is getting the same count. So is the Bitcoin ETF. So as MicroStrategy moves with Bitcoin because they have such huge exposure to Bitcoin. We're getting 9 counts on all of them in the weekly time frame. NASDAQ got it 2 weeks ago. And again, this is showing price exhaustion. The last one we got over here gave us this sell-off. The CEO aggressively selling. And the same thing with other billionaires like Jeff Bezos. He's been aggressively selling into the Amazon rally. We're watching to see if we get a perfected 9 count before the weekends, or does this count get canceled out? We'll be watching the close on Nvidia tomorrow. Close and the weekly close by the end of the week. Go a little bit higher, we can go up to the upper boundary of the rising wedge, but right here with this 9 count developing here in the weekly time frame. Now for the week, Nvidia was up. We'll see what it looks like at the end of the week by earnings. But again, here in the weekly time frame, you've got this triple negative divergence going on. This divergence gave us all of that selling back over here to the 20-week moving average and moving just beyond it. Again, now we have a lower high with the RSI, but prices moved higher. You've got the possibility of a double top pattern if we stall in this area. We do have this larger channel in the weekly time frame, but we're stalling right here at this peak right here at the longer term upper boundary of the channel in the monthly time frame. So it's just something worth paying attention to. But this is the weekly chart right here. Again, you start coming back down, or again, go a little higher and start coming back down, or go much, much higher and come back down into channel right here, the upper end of this channel. Again, then looking at this trend line in the 20-week would be bearish. Holding above it would be a sign of strength, but you've got this triple divergence developing. Again, the terminating of the AI rally will likely terminate the NASDAQ rally. Paying attention to this divergence. It may not be done yet. Again, we may go higher again and still have the divergence, but at higher levels. We'll be watching how we close out. But right now, Nvidia was down after the earnings being reported. We'll see how we close tomorrow. So just be aware of this divergence right here. And on the MACD, you've got this divergence going on right here with the previous peak there from the June high. And again, that was over here. Nvidia got a lower high in July, and NASDAQ moved to a higher high and peaked. So again, just pay attention to this divergence going on here. Weekly time frame, triple divergence on the RSI, negative divergence on the MACD. Now, this is all the history on Nvidia. This is the long-term weekly chart going back into the 90s. Okay, and again, you can see the channel, the lower boundary here, connecting these lows here, slightly violated it here with this peak parallel upper boundary, and we hit that here. Very similar to what we're seeing with NASDAQ and S&P 500 with the longer-term channel lines. Again, a perfectly parallel boundary here coming up to our June peak, and now again to our current high recently made. Here we have that. So we're up against major resistance here, and again, we do go higher. We do have a rising wedge, the upper boundary of a rising wedge, and this trend line to contend with. The channel I showed you in the weekly time frame is this black channel here, this rise that we've had right here. Here it is again, going back to the 2022 low. That's when NASDAQ bottomed. That's this low right here. This makes the lower boundary of a larger channel. Should we clear this level, then you have this blue upper channel. If we get rejection in this area or at that upper boundary of the rising wedge on the daily chart, which I'll show you in just a second, then I'll be watching, do we break this channel in the weekly time frame, this smaller channel, and break this trend line and start moving back down, forming a possible double top at this upper channel. So as we have these earnings and these blowout earnings here, we're at this major level of resistance on Nvidia. And why we're talking about Nvidia is because NASDAQ follows Nvidia. So again, we want to be paying very close attention to what's going on with Nvidia. We are at this major trend line. We do have this smaller channel and this very large long-term channel, and this one potentially, if we start clearing this level. So again, watching this long-term black trend line right here, do we turn off of it and break this other smaller channel with Nvidia? If we do, move towards recession here, coming months, we could see that happen should we turn off of this black trend line right here, this long-term channel. I'll be watching this closely. Attempt to get above it, or do we turn off of it? Right now, Nvidia is down on earnings, at least so far. We'll see how we close out the week. We'll see how we close out tomorrow's session. Do keep in mind, we are getting the 9-count sell signal on the weekly chart, and this is, again, the weekly chart, the longer term. We are getting that 9 count as we're pushing up into this long-term upper channel, this long-term upper channel of resistance. I did point this chart out to you ahead of earnings as well. Thing I'm paying attention to. Nvidia had a major trend line of resistance. You got the NASDAQ and the S&P at major trend lines of resistance, slightly overhead. Bitcoin at a major trend line of resistance. So interesting. And what's really interesting is in the weekly time frame, you have both Nvidia getting that 9 count. Well, Bitcoin's doing the same thing this week. So again, the two assets with the most volatility getting 9 count reversal bars this week. Again, the 9 count doesn't mean you get a reversal this with the 9 bar. You could, but sometimes you go a little bit higher. We'll be watching those 9 counts on both Bitcoin and Nvidia. Nvidia's got this rising wedge. And again, I talked about this pink trend line, accelerated trend line. We broke it. We got back above it. We're closing right on the 10 period right now. If we looked at Nvidia just a little bit ago, we were down just a little bit. We recovered off the lows of the earnings, but we'll see how we close tomorrow's session and then on into the end of the week. We had this negative divergence that's given us this pullback. I'm going to be watching. Does Nvidia make its way back up to this upper boundary? And that allows the S&P and NASDAQ to fill their gaps. Nvidia already did. And again, does this rising wedge end up producing a reversal for Nvidia? Nvidia moved just above the June high here, and you've got potentially a double top pattern with this just overthrowing this area just a little bit, as I've been talking about. Again, could we see a triple divergence here if we do end up recovering with Nvidia? Here, do we see this triple divergence develop on the MACD and on the RSI? I'll be watching this closely, but again, we had a sell-off, we rebounded, and then today we had some volatility and recovered off of the lows, our 20-period moving average on Nvidia. So again, this is the same pattern that's forming on NASDAQ, again, from the levels over here, from the lows here in August. Again, the same exact rising wedge is developing on the NASDAQ. So again, carbon copy of the Nvidia price action here. Be watching. Now, Nvidia has filled the gap. NASDAQ has not. We'll be watching to see if we get the rally with Nvidia. And if Nvidia does attempt to rally back up to the upper boundary, or sometimes these rising wedges, you even overthrow it, then we'll be watching. Again, does this rising wedge complete and act as a reversal pattern for both Nvidia and potentially for NASDAQ as well. But we could see Nvidia rise up to this boundary or even keep going, attempting to keep going if we seeing a powerful move surrounding earnings. But right now, we are down at the moment. That could change, but we're going to be watching this upper boundary on Nvidia. Even if it goes a little bit higher, you still have potentially this reversal pattern and a larger reversal pattern in the form of a double top with the June peak. Nvidia chart, I promise, again, it's important to pay attention to this because of its heavy influence on NASDAQ 100. Talked about this possibility, again, of a double top. And again, a double top, usually you get a slightly lower high or a slightly higher high. Now, if we blow past this area, then you don't have that possibility anymore. But we're just a little bit above this area here with this potential wedge that we just saw on the other chart, which again, here it is, in the black outline there, could be part of this larger double top pattern if we fail here and break down from this rising wedge. So that's what I'll be watching, and then again end up dropping back below the June low here, this June low right here, which we did attempt to do right here, but we found support right at it, and then we rebounded back up. So again, do we go up like that and then come back down? Do we break down immediately? Or do we get a big move higher and start trying to clear that longer term weekly resistance that I showed you just a moment ago on the weekly chart? To the NASDAQ, and again, here's the monthly chart. You're up here at this longer term trend line right here, back to the 1980s. We're just slightly under it. If NASDAQ rises up, again, we could slam right into it or fall short of it if it ends up diverging with the S&P 500. My guess is the S&P 500 is going to go up and hit the longer-term trend line nearly 100 years old, which I've talked about at great length and detail just to show it to you quickly. Again, we're just directly underneath that. It comes in around 6,040, maybe 50, that little window there, but right around that mid 6,000 area or so, or just underneath it. Again, if we overthrow it a little bit, we can go into the 6,100 area. If we hit the trend line in the weekly time frame, we could go into the 6,100 range and overthrow this level a little bit, but a major trend line. We're at a major trend line on NASDAQ. We're at a major trend line on the S&P. We're at a major trend line on Nvidia. A couple of major trend lines there on Bitcoin. Again, it's going to be interesting to watch what happens at these trend lines. If you want to see my latest Bitcoin video and see the trend lines I'm talking about, I'll link that Bitcoin video at the end of this video so you can see that. Those trend lines that I'm talking about, I don't have time to show you. And Bitcoin are getting the 9 count. NASDAQ just got it. And sometimes you get the 9 count and you go a little higher. Other times it marks a turn. It could mark a pullback. It could mark a reversal. Either one. So again, keep that in mind as we're getting that on Nvidia. Had it on the NASDAQ 100. I'll show it to you quickly. Here is, again, Nvidia with the 9 count. We'll see how we close by the end of the week. Do we complete that 9 bar? As long as we don't close below the bar from 4 weeks ago. Just had it on QQQ about 2 weeks ago, and again, you got the 9 count, you went slightly higher, you got that reversal. Again, we were up big time right here, gave much of it back, and here we are right now. But you have the 13.9 over here that gave us this sell-off. So again, the counts just tell you prices are starting to get tired. You get a couple of different things. You either get a reversal, you get a pullback followed by an immediate trend extension, or you get an immediate trend extension, one of those three. But the 9 counts can lead to reversals. They can lead to pullbacks. And so we're watching this 9 count closely. We're probably forming a large head and shoulders on Nvidia if back down to the August lows, or that double top if we don't form right shoulders. Here on NASDAQ, same thing. You see on Nvidia how it could drag out if we don't get a double top. If we sell off and we bounce right here, you've got the possibility of a head and shoulders as well. So just something we're paying attention to longer term. But I'm watching this rising wedge. I'm watching the double top, the potential double top at this point. Here's a NASDAQ weekly chart. Again, I showed you the trend line that we're just slightly under it in the monthly time frame. Here we hit this one, and we were just a fraction underneath it, barely underneath it, perfectly parallel to the lower boundary here from the pandemic low in 2020 to the 2022 low, and then the November 2021 high. Again, we're slamming right up into that level. We're just slightly underneath it. Still may test it again, but you've got this divergence going on, very similar to the divergences that are developing on Nvidia in the weekly time frame. You got a divergence here. You've got a divergence down here on the monthly chart, on the MACD, pardon me. And again, we'll be watching these divergences if they begin to play out. But again, we might revisit these levels. Now, again, I want to continue to point out, oftentimes at a turning point, NASDAQ and S&P will diverge. Sometimes that happen at tops and bottoms. At the July peak, NASDAQ made a lower high, and S&P made a higher high. We saw the same thing at the 2022 peak for S&P. NASDAQ made a lower high, and S&P made a higher high. They often diverge. So S&P very well can go higher. NASDAQ may not if we are completing the final stage of the blow-off top. I believe that we're forming completing a blow-off top is how markets usually end. Creates total complacency when you get that. So just want to show you these charts now. As we're getting this push up into this trend line here and turning off of it, we have again a rising wedge, just very, very similar to what we have with Nvidia. Here's Nvidia's one more time. Compare this to the NASDAQ. Here it is. Here's our rising wedge on the NASDAQ. Now again, similar to what we have on Nvidia. Again, we moved above the July peak over here, and we filled the gap back over here. I talked about filling that gap. I thought that the July peak was likely in because we were turning off of those trend lines at the time that I told you about and getting a 9 count back over here. Now we've done the same thing over here. We've gotten the 9 count up at the highs right here, and we've turned off of it. So again, we could inch a little bit higher. We did slightly. Actually, we got the 9 count right there, and we inched slightly above it and then turned. That might be it. And we get a lower high, fill this gap at 20,897 and then turn, and we see NASDAQ and S&P diverge, or we can get another push up into the upper boundary should we rebound, which again, I think we're likely going to see the S&P move to a new high. The jury is still out on the NASDAQ. They could diverge, or we could see this level tested. This may be a peak, or we may get a push up into it one more time and then turn. If we do complete the topping process around the trend lines that I'm talking about, could overthrow the trend line on the S&P and move to the 6100 area. I'll be watching that, but I'm looking at these gaps. I think these gaps will fill. I think that Nvidia's gap's already filled. I think Nvidia will back up to the upper boundary of the rising wedge, or even overthrow it. And if it does, and test long-term resistance, if it does, NASDAQ could come back up here, fill the gap, get a lower high, or move back to a new high and then turn. But these rising wedges have expanded. Again, I talked about the previous boundaries and so forth, and we've seen the pattern expand. We've seen the same thing on the S&P 500. So again, I'll be watching to see what happens here. Again, you can get a divergence or a confirmation of a lower high on the RSI and the MACD. So we're at this trend line. I told you again, we're at the 50 period that we'd get a presidential election rally and a rally or reversal with the Fed, depending on what happens. We got the rally with both. Told you again, there were bullish signals on here, down here at the 60-minute time frame ahead of the presidential election. I told you to be looking for a rally. We can even move to new highs because we hadn't reached my target level yet on the S&P 500. Now we're hitting this trend line again, right here, excluding the shadow. So again, I think the gap will fill. I think that we will see these rising wedges eventually play out. A possible double top that could evolve into a head and shoulders. But again, I think you're eventually going to come back and test these August lows. NASDAQ daily chart here. NASDAQ was down 17.5 points, down 0.08%. It was down much lower at the lows of the session, but we recovered off of, again, the 200 period, testing it. We got another higher low after, again, this low coming near to fill the gap at 20,227. We rebounded. Now, again, it's possible we have bear flag patterns forming. That's possible. And then we end up seeing NASDAQ go down and fill the gap before we come up and fill this gap. But I do think this gap is going to get filled at the 20,900 level, rounding up. But if we do it immediately, then this low can hold. But if this bear flag plays out, then we do something like this probably, and then come back up here. So we'll be watching to see how it unfolds with the Nvidia earnings by tomorrow's close. You end up or down tomorrow. Currently, as I'm making the video, it's down about 2%. Again, it was as low as over 5%. How it closes there on earnings. But I do think this gap is going to get filled, whether we go down and fill this one first and then come back up, or whether we do this right here, right now, bouncing off our 200 period moving average. We'll be watching. There was no bullish divergence, but we could be confirming a higher low if we can clear this peak right here. We're stalling here at gap resistance on NASDAQ. The gap lower right here from Friday, we're stalling right there at this peak right here and just directly under it at the close. Minute chart, NASDAQ 100. Again, same thing. S&P, it sold off, tested the 20 period. Again, tested the low. I talked about that yesterday, about it testing the lows. moving to a lower low and testing the trend line here, or getting a higher low and then making our way higher. So far, but we still have a possible bear flag forming on the intraday charts, the 15-minute chart, the 60-minute chart. So we'll be watching. Again, do we still test this level in the 50 periods right underneath it, or do we come back up here in this 59.50 area? Again, I think we're eventually going to make our way back to the upper boundary. I think we're forming a larger rising wedge. Again, we could diverge with NASDAQ if that happens. And NASDAQ may have already peaked back over here just over a week ago. So we'll be watching how that unfolds. We had this divergence that's given us a sell-off. We might form a divergence in this more recent price action. And the rising wedge is likely evolving into a larger pattern here with this low right here. Go up here and reach this level. Again, we'll be reaching that upper channel line in the monthly time frame, and we'll likely move into the 100 level and reach the upper boundary on the weekly chart, which I think is still very, very possible. We go up to hit that upper boundary of the rising wedge. We have this larger rising wedge in the weekly time frame going all the way back to the peak in March here, and the July peak. If we connect those levels, it intersects with this upper boundary, the blue trend line right here, parallel to this lower boundary, the low here, the low here, the peak here, the peak here. And again, that's all coming up here in the 6100 area. So again, if we come up here and we try to tag these levels, or just fall short of these levels, again, our other trend line right here comes into play. Again, close to that level, as I've said. Again, we have these divergences in play. Again, I'll be watching to see, can the S&P make a new all-time high? My guess is, again, that it will. And I think we'll reach the target level in the monthly time frame, and maybe as high as this upper channel line here in the weekly time frame. And that could take us into possibly the 6100 range there in the weekly time frame. So just something I'm watching. Again, the rally can continue. It could go longer, maybe a week or two to reach that level. I think the S&P is going to peak in 2024. Said there was no evidence of a top with the last peak that was made over here. I continue to believe that we're going to continue to make new all-time highs in all likelihood. Topping process completes, because again, I'm looking at these trend lines in the weekly and the monthly time frame. Complacency, the bears pretty much thrown in the towel. Got this blow off top that is forming, that I've been talking about. New all-time highs, new all-time highs. That goes back to fill the gap. And then I told you, if NASDAQ fills the gap, goes higher, it can go up to the trend lines, tag them again, which it's now doing. Bears have thrown in the towel. And again, bulls are completely complacent. Again, this is sucking in the bulls and created the short squeeze for the bears, designed to do as much damage to both bulls and bears alike, suck in the bulls, scourge the bears, or we get a big move. And again, I've been patiently waiting. Signals remain bullish in the weekly time frame. Momentum try to turn there, NASDAQ, but again, with the S&P momentum on the momentum line and so forth. But again, the weekly charts, I think this is still under construction. And again, exactly what we had in 2007. Started cutting. They got inflation. Exactly what they're doing right now. And right after that, after they began cutting, months later, the recession started. Completely blindsided by it. They're blindsided by the coming recession right now. So again, we're likely going to witness a topping process. Watch my video yesterday. Showed you my indicator, volatility oscillator for the S&P 500. I'll tell you exactly when the top is completing, and it will confirm it. Watch that video. It's very short. Watching this trend line, these trend lines here from 2024, and this longer term trend line going back to 2022 for the channel, then watching that monthly trend line, then watching again the upper boundary of the rising wedge here in 2024 from these highs in July that gave us that counter trend in the July sell-off. S&P sold off today, but it was flat. It ended flat. Just barely squeaking out a gain. We came back up, bouncing off the 200, came back up to the 50. Got a possible bear flag here that if we go back and fill the gap and test the trend line, as I've talked about, you could form a divergence on the RSI. Watching to see if we come back up here, make a brand new divergence up here, if we go up to the upper boundary of the rising wedge, or build upon this one right here and end up forming a larger divergence. And either scenario is possible. So again, I'll be watching that. But I told you about this pullback before it happened with the diversions here. Told you about this rally before it happened with the bullish diversions at key support here. Talked about these turning points over and over again, and these divergences have given us some really, really good signals back and forth. If I zoom in and bring this up close, you can see what I'm looking at here. We got a possible bear flag. Now again, patterns are meaningless unless they get confirmed. So if we start breaking this down, then we're likely going to come back and fill the gap here, 57.83, and again, possibly test our trend line in the daily time frame, which is this red trend line right here from this low. So again, these are the levels I'm looking at. Now again, if we bounce off our 200 period and we've just tested the low and back tested, remember I told you about the channel yesterday? Did we just back test the trend line? And now we're going to go higher and go back to fill the gap at the 59.50 area and maybe challenge this high, which I think is likely, and go and get a rally? Or do we break down first, test the trend line, fill the gap, or again, fill the gap and break the trend line slightly, fill the gap and get back above it and then come back up? We'll be watching to see how it unfolds. Does this gap get filled first, or does this gap get filled first? I'll be watching that. Possible bear flag. That doesn't mean it has to play out, because it could just be a back test of this trend line that we broke out of that I talked about in great length and detail yesterday. There was no bullish diversions here. There doesn't have to be. But again, these divergences here and over here and back over here, they've marked some really nice turns for us here in the 60-minute time frame. I've talked about every single one, and they have played out very nicely. Do you believe this gap is going to fill? I'll be watching to see if we challenge this high. My guess is we will. But again, days are numbered. I think the days are numbered with those divergences that are forming in the weekly time frame. S&P has dodged the bullet. Now, the momentum shifted with the momentum line in the daily time frame, but we haven't got the cloud flipping to bearish here. It's dodged the bullet for 2 days in a row here, actually 3 days in a row, week long here on the S&P 500. The momentum turned bearish on NASDAQ. We got the red bars, but the cloud never did flip. So again, I'll be watching to see if we go back to fill the gap and try to challenge the high, or again, take out the 20 period and try to fill the gap down here and test our 50 period and the rising trend line that I've been talking about. See in this video, I think we'll get green bars here. I'm watching to see though, do we go red and go down and then try to turn back up, or do we start seeing green and try to rebound off our 20 period moving average here? But both of those scenarios, whichever way it plays out, look, it could play out a couple different ways. I still think we're going to make new all-time highs and reach my objective target levels there on those weekly and monthly charts for the S&P 500. I've made that clear. I start seeing evidence that the weekly charts are going to play out immediately right here, right now with our recent peak. I don't see that evidence yet. One thing that makes me think we'll get it very soon is we're getting a red bar on the Awesome Oscillator this week. It doesn't necessarily mean the top is in, but again, could. But oftentimes, again, with the first, second, or third bar, oftentimes you'll rally up to fill a gap or get a lower high or get a higher high. You could do that the first, second, or third week. Sometimes you get the red bar, you'll rally up with it, which is what we're doing right now, which is interesting. But regardless, we have triple negative divergence. Triple negative divergence and quadruple negative divergence are the strongest reversal signals in technical analysis. So again, this is going to play out. You've got the same thing going on with Nvidia. You got the same thing going on with the NASDAQ. It's a divergence. S&P has a triple divergence. But again, we're bouncing off our 10-week moving average. Again, things are still bullish here in the weekly time frame. I think you're likely going to reach the objective target levels, and then we'll see if we come back and take out the 10 and 20-week moving averages. I think that if we do it immediately, that would be a sign of weakness. But if we can rally further, I think you can hit the target levels and then reverse off of them and then see this divergence begin to play out in the coming weeks ahead. The topping process. I'm looking for new all-time highs. Saying that, yes, I think a bear market and a reversal is coming, a bear market crash eventually follow, but right now I'm looking for a topping process. Right now I've been looking for new all-time highs to reach my objective target levels in the monthly and the weekly time frame. I'm looking for a top. Some people don't hear, hey, I think we're going to reach new all-time highs. Hey, we can go to the mid 6,000 to 6,100 level on the S&P 500. Well, people have selective hearing and they cherry pick what they want to hear. I still believe we're going to go to new all-time highs in all likelihood, and I still believe the topping process on the S&P and NASDAQ. Here it is on NASDAQ, and again, we bounced off that 50-week moving average, got back above the 20, and here we are above the 10 and 20. We sold off last week. Bars are still blue, the cloud is still green, but we're getting a red bar. So again, the divergence is present. NASDAQ weekly chart.